Hello, I'm Lachlan from the Dysfunctional Consultant. A few months ago, I went to the Dynamics Community Summit in Melbourne. It was an awesome few days connecting with everyone and going to all the sessions. The last presentation I went to was on PowerApps governance and was delivered by Paul Kumsey. It was an excellent session that introduced me to the admin and maker connections for PowerApps and Flow. On the plane home, I was wondering what the capabilities of the PowerApps for Apps Makers connector in particular was, and I was really pleasantly surprised after I did some exploring. There's a really extensive post from August on the PowerApps blog explaining what these new connectors are, and there is documentation available too. And there are a lot of cool things we can do with these connectors, but the one that really jumped out to me was the ability to get app versions. Finally, like every other application in the world, can I display inside the Canvas app the current version number? For those that don't know or aren't familiar, Canvas Apps comes with its own version control. Every time you hit save, it automatically creates a new version of the Power App. You can see these versions by clicking Details on an app from the maker and then selecting the Versions tab. So you would go here, Details, and then you get the Versions tab. The list indicates which version is currently published and, the published version is your live version. And this is all very useful stuff, but hey, wouldn't it be so much more useful if I could expose it inside my app somehow? And I can think of so many times, particularly with embedded Canvas apps, where I wondered if my change has been applied or if it's been stuck in a cache somewhere. And really what I needed to know was, has the version number changed? Has my change that I've just saved and published incremented the version number? Has that been applied? And am I now seeing the latest version? And I'm pleased to report you can do this now with this connector. So without further ado, how do we do it? At a high level, there's 5 steps. Step 1, we need to make the app self-aware. We need to tell the app who it is. And basically, we just need to figure out what the app's GUID is or the app ID, and then put that in the app somewhere. Step 2, we need to add the PowerApps for Makers connection into the Power App. That's pretty easy. And step 3, we need to transform the data we get back from that into something useful and figure out how many versions there actually are. Step 4, we then need to figure out which one's the published version. And then step 5, we just display the version number. Okay, so here I have an app that I created a while back just for a demo, and I'm going to add a new screen on it so I can make it self-aware and put all this stuff on. So here's another screen down the back. And this is pretty simple. I'm just going to add a button in, and on set, I'm going to say app number. This is the keyword. Don't know the keyword yet. So if I go back to my details tab, not the versions tab, I see the app ID. I grab this, and then I put it in there. Okay, so voila. I have a button. Set my app ID. Make that a little bit bigger so we can see it. So if I run this, I set that in the back end. I now have a variable that is app number. That's a keyword. Happy days. So then the next thing is pretty easy. I need to insert or create the connector to PowerApps for App Makers. It's already there, but if you were to search for it, it'll come up. That's it. It's added in. Happy days. So let's create another button. I'm going to call this button step 2, retrieve versions. This is pretty easy as well. We're going to create a collection. Let's call this my apps versions. Now the items of that collection are going to be Power Apps for Makers dot get app versions, and then the app is going to be my app. What do I call it? App number. Cool. Happy days. So now when I run this guy, I get some data back. The first thing to do is to check out the data we get back from the function. Good news is it's all there. Bad news is it comes in a tricky structure. We get one record back in our collection, but that record has collections inside it. So to work with them, we need to put that collection inside the collection in a new collection, or rather, ungroup the data. To do that, I'll create another collection and use the ungroup function on the previous collection. Clear as mud, I'll do it. Cool. So now if I run this, I'll have another collection, my apps ungroup. So bang, straight away, I've now got a list of all my app versions. Now, when I put this new collection in a gallery, it starts to resemble something promising. Bear with me, I'll actually do it. So here we have a gallery of versions. Before I go on, I want to share what I discovered about the PowerApp version number. If we go back to the version tab of the detail screen, we can see the sequential column listing all the versions. As we press save, the version number goes up. But in the data, what's actually stored behind the scenes, this isn't actually reflected. Instead, the actual version number is the timestamp of when the app was saved. So for us to render the version number in the app, we're going to need to continue to transform the data until we can get version number 1 or version number 7, version number 6. So right now, I can really easily figure out how many versions in total there are. That's not hard at all. Let me do that. We'll just do a count rows in my apps ungrouped. 7 versions. A little bit bigger. 7 versions. 7 versions. It's not lying. However, what I need to do now is find the published version, the current live version, and count it and all versions that have come before it. So to do that, I need to look up within my existing collection the version with the properties.lifecycle ID that equals published. And I'm actually pretty lucky when I do that too, as I'll do a lookup in a second to this collection and I'll retrieve the first value which has that property. And I'm lucky because the data set is always returned with the latest version on top. Once I have that value, I can create a new collection, another collection on a collection, which is a subset of the previous collection, but it only includes those records which are equal to the current live published version or versions that were created before it. So let's do that now. So I'll create another button. And let's call this one Step 4, find the published version. And in here, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to set another variable We'll call this published version. This is going to be a bit tricky. I need to do a lookup to my ungrouped versions collection. And we're looking for ones where the properties dot lifecycle ID equals published. However, I just want from that record its properties dot app version. Now, once I have that record, I can create another collection. Let's call this my published and earlier versions. It's just getting silly. And that will be a subset or a filter of my app versions ungrouped, where properties dot app versions less than or equal to my published version. Let's close that up and let's trigger it. Okay, so I've got my app versions, that's what was originally retrieved. Now I've got my ungrouped ones, and then underneath that my published and earlier versions. Looks very similar. In fact, it might actually be the exact same list in this instance of the app, but we will test that. So let's create another version of this guy and call this published version. And this is going to be count rows of, whatever this one was called. Cool, so the published version is version 7. Is that true? Oh, version 6. So let's save and publish. Now, here under versions, we have 7 versions. Let's create another version. New button. Let's save that. Let's not publish. We now have 8 versions in total. Right, let's press all these buttons again. Set the app ID. Let's retrieve the versions. Let's ungroup that collection. I've got 8 versions, and then let's find the published version. Published version, version 7. Happy days. So let's now delete this app. Delete this button rather. Let's save that change. Let's not publish. We can see here we've now got version 9. If I run this all again, I've got 9 total versions. The published version is still version 7. If I come here and I publish this, I'll run it all again. Still 9 versions, but published version is now version 9. Happy days. Wow, we got there. That was fun. So this is a pretty long process, and there are a few steps in it which I only went through so we can understand how we need to transform the data. Looking at the whole process, I can straight away think of a few improvements. Firstly, it would be awesome if we could call the app ID within the app itself. I really think there should be a formula for this. I've submitted the idea in the PowerApps forum, and it would be great if you could upvote it. I'll have a link in the comments. Secondly, we can find the published version and count the previous versions without creating additional collections. I've just done that so that we can think through what's happening. The formulas to do so would look something like this. We would still set the app ID. Then we would get the versions. But then when we find the published version, we'll do the ungrouping and the lookup in one go. Much simpler, a bit more efficient. A little bit harder to understand though. Now, thirdly, the third improvement, let's actually challenge this requirement. Do you actually need the version number, Lachlan, in your app, or do you just need the modified on date of the version you are running? If that's acceptable, it'll look like this. We set the app ID, and we get the versions, and we just do a lookup to find the latest one that's published, and we show the app version number. I think that's pretty good. And that's it. As always, please let me know if you have any questions or feedback. I will have a .msapp file available for download if you'd like to play around with the app I just built. Thank you for watching.